All right, if we're just getting things set up real quick, we'll be starting right at 2 o'clock, so we got about 4 minutes. So I see that it's someone's got a comment that says there's a lot of echo. Let me see if I can fix that really quick. Hang on a second. Okay, so do we hear echoes now? We'll be starting in just about a minute here. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Katie, and I'm the interim director curator here at the Clark Historical Museum in Old Town, Eureka. Just want to say thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Today, I'm just going to do a little bit of kind of an informational event on protests in Humboldt County. If you have any questions during this presentation, feel free to put them in the comments. I have a crazy setup here. I have a second computer with 2 different screens on it, and it's got the comments up there so I can see the questions as they come in. There is a little bit of a lag, just so you know. So I might pass by your question before it shows up on my screen. So be patient. And if I miss any questions at the end, feel free to ask them again, and I can answer those for you. So we'll go ahead and get started. So this presentation is on protests in Humboldt County. It's kind of a really brief survey of protests in Humboldt County. Of course, the county's been around a very long time, and there's been a lot of protests over that period. So this is just kind of a super above the surface survey. So of course, two things. Man, I don't know why. So two things, and I hope the echo isn't too bad. I'm not sure why there would be an echo. Let me see if maybe this will help. Oh, okay, I know why. There we go. Okay, I think I've got it figured out really quick. There we go. Okay, that should have fixed the echo problem. So let me know if you still hear any echoes, and I'll try to figure it out. So this is a survey of protests held in Humboldt County. So a couple things about that. Two things, main things. So this isn't an exhaustive list or an advanced analysis of the protests. This is, like I said, kind of a bird's eye view of a couple protests. So with that, I encourage you to look more into some of these protests if you have strong reactions to any of them. Some of them are more current protests, so there are still a lot of feelings around some of these protests I'm going to talk about. But I encourage, if you have any strong reactions, I did include resources at the end of this. I encourage you to look more into it, kind of dive into what makes you uncomfortable. When I was in the religious studies department at HSU, one of the things they taught us, which has been just incredibly helpful over the course of my life post-college, is that there's this way where you can kind of imagine yourself putting on a VR helmet and envisioning what it's like to be someone else, someone that you don't agree with, kind of try to experience the world in their shoes for a little bit, but realizing that you can still take off that VR helmet and you are still you. You might be changed by the experience. So that's something I really encourage you to do. And at the end of this presentation, there will be a digital version available. There's a bunch of links in this, so you'll be able to click through, kind of look at different things. My speaker's notes should be also included, so you'll be able to see what kind of information we went over. And of course, this video will be up on our website. It'll be up on our Facebook, so you can review it and share it. So these protests all throughout our county's history and everywhere else as well, though they cover all kinds of different topics. We got natural resources, social issues, political issues, labor issues, economic issues. And of course, all of those listed, those are only some of them, but they all are interconnected in one way or another. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started and take a look at some of these protests. So the first one happened in 1935. And it's documented in this book, Organized, the Great Lumber Strike of Humboldt County. And this is one that not a lot of people know about, or if you do know about it, there might just be kind of a superficial, not a very kind of high level looking down on it kind of understanding of it. But if you want to learn more, this is a good book to check out. So the way I'm kind of laying out this this presentation is I'll talk about the circumstances, the goals, the things that happened, and the outcomes of many of these protests. So with this one, the circumstances, of course, 1935, we're in the Great Depression. There was a decline in timber demand due to economic decline. People weren't building houses, people weren't moving, and there was hard times in the economy. And the lumber economy is usually hit pretty hard whenever there's an economic decline. There were harsh working conditions, low wages that were persisting in this time. There were a lot of people out of work, so companies could pay people less to do work. There were recurring union strikes happening around the country, including adjacent industries like longshoremen in 1934. They protested up and down the coast. Some of the goals of this particular protest was to raise the minimum wage, of course, lower the number of hours in a work week. I believe the hours at the time were 60 hours in a work week. They wanted to lower it to 48 and make it a 6-day work week. They also wanted to have union recognition, which many lumber mills at the time did not allow. So what happened first was there was some union organizing going on. The unions were not recognized by the lumber companies, however, but one of the unions organized was with the Sawmill and Timber Workers Union, STWU, under the American Federation of Labor. There were requests made to the employers, like the requests that I mentioned earlier for the goals. And when the employers declined to follow through on those requests, there was a strike that began on May 6th along the entirety of the Pacific Coast, encompassing all kinds of different timber companies. And there were also companies that refused to purchase timber from these other companies that were protesting. So on June 21st, there was a strike at the Holmes Eureka Mill, which is now the site of the Bayshore Mall. During that protest, 3 people ended up dying. In this news article, it mentions that there's 1 person who dies, 2 people die later on. And then 1 person is injured so badly they had to have their leg amputated. There were claims that the FBI was present, but those claims were denied by J. Edgar Hoover, who was in charge of the FBI at the time. The local newspapers had a very anti-union view at this point in time. These are 2 newspapers from out of the area, but local newspapers were also against kind of this union organizing that was going on. So the results of this strike, there were some companies that complied with the strike, but not all requests were met. Tear gas was shot into the crowd during this protest, and a canister hit a woman in the face. There were 4 people who died, like I mentioned. 3 of them were Finns, people from Finland. At the time, there was a sentiment that Finns tended to be communist. And there were other people in the Finnish community locally that were arrested, supposedly for being connected to the communists and this protest. In the end, 114 people are arrested, but no one is arrested for the killing of the 3 protesters who died as part of this protest. And union effort ends up being stifled for about 10 years. And like I mentioned, some mills did go along with the requests of the protesters, but not everyone did. And both of these newspaper articles are taken from a really great resource called the UC Riverside California Digital Newspaper Archives, which is a great free source for people to use to research local history. Many of the local articles that I use in different exhibits and things like that come from that. And I believe the Blue Lake Advocate has been recently added, which is a great addition to helping us understand our local history. So the next one I'm going to talk about is Redwood National and State Parks. I'll be talking about the expansion movement, which specifically happened from 1968 to 1978. And of course, the work done to create a national park was extensive. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So the earliest call for a Redwood National Park or some kind of park operated by the federal government was in 1852. But at the time, there were so many redwoods, logging had barely even started, if anything. So it was kind of dropped for a bit, and then it was picked up again in 1918 with the creation of Save the Redwoods League and all the work that the local women did to promote the preservation of the redwoods. And 1946, there was a proposition for a huge park that would be named after FDR that would encompass 90% of Humboldt and Del Norte counties. It was highly protested because the counties said that there would be massive losses in income for the counties because of the loss of land taxes. It was also opposed by Save the Redwoods League because this particular park would be run by the Forest Service, which would allow for selective logging, and Save the Redwoods League wanted no logging to happen in whatever park they ended up creating. So, okay, now we get to kind of our time period here. So post-World War II, there was rapid logging of old-growth redwood due to a housing boom. There was a lot of improved technology, allowing more trees to be cut down with less effort or less manpower, because there were many different machines that could assist with that. There were clear cuts going on. At the time, it was seen to be an okay practice. They led to many negative environmental impacts on large pieces of land in Humboldt County, including watersheds and old growth forest. There were logging companies that claimed logging on steep slopes and things like that did not have an impact on the environment, or perhaps that it was actually better for the forest because then more trees, younger trees, could grow in the place of a couple larger trees. But that turned out to not be the case, and there was a lot of debate over that that I could go into, but I'm not going to go into it right now. And the thing that was kind of happening with this is the land that people wanted to turn into a national park was now privately owned. Early on, of course, the land was owned by the federal government, and it was almost more or less given away. And that was through the Timber and Stone Act. There's a whole book on that history. But at this point in time, land was owned by larger timber companies. And if the government was going to get the land back to create a park, they were going to have to purchase it at fair market value. And at this point in time, since there's such a housing boom and redwood prices are booming, it was going to be very expensive to create this park or expand it, since the lumber had to be purchased at fair market value. This is a great little picture. I like this kid hanging out in the forest. He's got like a top hat on. I don't really know what his story is, but it's a great picture. So the goals of the protests against the expansion of the park. There were people who wanted to protect the remaining old growth redwood forest and then there were people that wanted to maintain employment and their historic livelihoods as loggers. So when the park was created in 1968, there were calls almost immediately to expand the park. And that was because the way the park was structured, and I wish I had a picture of this map. We had a map on display that showed what the original park looked like and what the expansion of the park was going to look like. But when the original park was created, it was kind of this weird gerrymandered kind of shape surrounding a certain distance on either side of a river, I think it was Redwood Creek actually. And it wound its way up through the watershed. And then there's a spot called Tall Trees Grove where eventually, actually it was just before the park was initially created, there was found to be the world's tallest tree at the time that we knew of. And so the park protected that little grove, but it didn't go up the hills of the watershed. So logging companies could log pretty darn near to the water, darn near to this grove. And it was a problem because when it rained, if there was a hillside nearby that was clear cut, the water would strip away the hillside even more. It would flood into the creeks. It would cause huge floods. It would just wipe out things. And it was an issue. And that was protested almost immediately. We need to protect this watershed, not just this little creek and this little spot of the trees. So that was why in 1968 there started to be this movement to protect a larger area rather than just that small area. So there were a lot of actions that happened for this period in time, and one that's, I think, particularly interesting has to do with this poster that's here. So this is a poster that is in the National Park Archives up in Orick. And this was produced as part of a protest operated by loggers, logging companies, people that had a stake in if the parks got expanded, their jobs might be at stake, their companies might be at stake. And this was a protest that took logging companies from across this kind of Pacific Northwest area took them from our area all the way out to Washington, D.C. to protest. And I'll show a little video with that because it's pretty interesting to see this particular protest. So the results of the protests that were going on is that eventually a Redwood National Park encompassing some old growth, but a majority of second growth and rehabilitated areas was created. So those second growth areas, they were the ones on the watershed surrounding the Tall Trees Grove. And it had largely been logged over. And there's some incredible images of these logged over areas that you can see online. I do have a link to our 2018 exhibit page that had to do with the creation of Redwood National and State Parks. And I highly encourage you checking it out. We have some great photos in there and some great information as well. So the Redwood National Park ended up not being completely old growth because by that point in time, most of the old growth was gone. But largely that second growth rehabilitated areas. And when you go through the park today, you'll still see that. And there is work being done by the National Park Service and different agencies to rehabilitate the areas and find a way to make them more resemblant of old growth forests. One of the things that many loggers would bring up, and logging companies and related people, is that while they were cutting down trees, they were planting more in its place. But the thing with that is that the trees that were being planted in their place sometimes were redwoods, sometimes they were not redwoods. And it was not the same forest. It was a densely crowded forest. It was a forest that didn't have the same ecosystem that the historic forest did. And there were a lot of issues with that. But I can always talk about that later. So while there was a severe curtailing of redwood logging locally because there was so much land moved into the park system, and it did diminish the economy in some areas and maybe many areas. There was a slight boon to the economy, to the local tourist economy, because now there was a park. It was a way that for the region to market itself, for people to come up here and visit. And we see this today. Well, maybe not today right now because of the COVID stuff, but we do see people coming up here specifically to see the redwoods. And it's a way for, our region to preserve a really fascinating part of our local and natural history. So this is the video I mentioned. We'll just watch a couple minutes of it. Let me turn this back on. Okay. So this is a video called Enough is Enough. It's by the Associated California Loggers. It was produced in 1977. And so this is part of that trucker protest I mentioned a little bit ago. And this is available through a website called Calisphere, which connects many archives from across California, usually through their university systems, to make more archive items accessible to the public. So, whoops. All right, let's take a look. Whoop. All right, so we're just gonna watch 5 minutes of this, but if you do have the time and want to watch the rest of it, I do recommend it. It's really interesting. All right, so let's fast forward a little bit. It's got a little bit of lead on here. Okay.
Before dawn, On May 10, 1977, they began to assemble in Eureka, California, for that long haul to Washington, D.C. They were loggers and truckers, factory workers and storekeepers, labor and management, a cross-section of the American working people. And they gathered in unity to begin stemming the tide of reckless preservationism that has for too long rolled on with gathering momentum unchallenged. It was time, the working people decided, to mount the challenge.
And, this is a culmination of a threat that was made, and it's been a real massive undertaking, and this thing was put together with the expertise of a lot of people in this community, and believe me, there's a lot of talent in this community. Other than that, I don't have too much more to say. It's about 2 minutes to 7, and Sam Brown's the wagon master, and he says we're going to roll at 7.
A balance needed to be found between harvesting natural resources for man's needs and preserving them for man's pleasure. They believe that the people of America can find the balance. They're going with their trucks to talk to America.
We're here because we want to take the story to the people of America. We want to talk to America about the Redwood issue. We want to refute the big lie that the last Redwood is ready to be cut.
The fact is, 181,000 acres of redwoods in over 100 parks and reserves are already protected by law.
We're going to go to Washington with the world's biggest peanut, and this peanut weighs 9 tons. We're going to take it back, and we'd like the president to take it down and plant it in Plains, Georgia, and then we're going to make a 50,000-acre park around his ranch.
The people who make their living in the woods recognize the need to preserve enough of our wilderness for future generations. At the same time, it must be recognized that trees are a renewable natural resource. Harvesting trees does not mean destruction of wilderness, because today both the public and private forest lands are managed as cropland. For each tree harvested, a dozen are planted. Argues with the need for adequate national parks and recreational wilderness across this land. There is also a valid need to preserve certain unique national heritages, like parts of the Redwoods, Kansas Prairie, Florida Everglades, Georgia swamps. The question is, how much?
All right, so that's only a snippet of this video. It's about a 17-minute video. I noticed in the comments there were a couple things pointed out. So reckless preservationism was one of them. And then man's needs versus man's pleasure is something that also comes up. And someone also asked if the peanut that the man was talking about is the Auric peanut, and yes, it is. The Auric peanut is one of just something that I really love about this area. I do not know why. It's just one of my favorite things. But if you go up to the town of Auric, right when you drive into town, there's this like orange and yellow gas station, or it used to be a gas station. Now it's kind of like a little convenience store kind of thing. And there's a big chunk of redwood sitting out there. That is the Auric peanut. And that was part of this protest. It showed up a couple times in the background of videos. Let me see if I can pull that back up so you guys can see it in case you might have missed it. But let's see. But anyway, that is the Auric peanut. So the idea behind the peanut, the 9-ton peanut, was that it was going to be taken out to Washington, D.C. and given to Jimmy Carter, who was the president at the time. Of course, he was known as the peanut farmer. And there was, I remember hearing from one guy who I think was part of this protest. He gave me a call after I did an article on it for Senior News. And there was a proposed idea to chain the peanut to the front of the White House that didn't materialize. But they wanted to take the peanut, they wanted to give it to Jimmy Carter. And as was mentioned in the video, move it to his plantation back home and have a park around it. But when they tried to give the peanut to Carter, some of Carter's aides were talking with them and they said, no, we can't accept this peanut. What are we going to do with this? So it ended up being sent back to Eureka, or sent back to Humboldt County, and ended up in the parking lot at the Auric Snack Shop. I think Snack Stop might be what it's called. So I do recommend watching the rest of this video. And yes, I have had my picture taken with the peanut. That was a question that just came up. So this kind of gives you a glimpse into how the logging industry kind of side of things was viewing the expansion of the park as reckless preservationism, as infringing on people's rights to have a job and to have work. One of the arguments that I kind of mentioned a little bit before was that there were already enough redwood trees. There was not going to be the end of the redwood as a tree through this logging, because more redwood trees were being planted, but they were not old growth. And that was where the problem came in. So anyway, really fascinating part of our region's history. There's a huge archive on this at Humboldt State. Plenty of books have been written about it. And it gets really interesting once you start looking into the nuances of these protests. So let's head back over here. And when you do download this slideshow, you click this. This is the link, and it'll take you right to that video. All right, let's get back into full screen. There we go. Whoop. Double jumped slides there. So next one I'll talk a little bit about is the Battle for Headwaters, which was part of a larger group of protests called Redwood Summer, which took place in the year 1990. So the circumstances, let's check these out. So this, like I mentioned earlier, is kind of one of the more recent protests, and there are still a lot of strong feelings about the people who participated in this, the way the protest played out, and there's a lot of unpacking to do when it comes to understanding what was going on here. So what was happening was there was still logging of old growth forests, and at this point in time, there was not a lot of old growth left, and much of it, some of it was held by companies. Some of it was held by companies. Much of it was in parks by this point in time, but there was still old growth ecosystems that were not held in the public trust, and people were really worried about that. People were worried about the impact it was having on different, the spotted owl is definitely one that comes up frequently. There were protests around Mendocino and Humboldt counties about this accelerated and continued old growth logging, including clear cutting. There was a proposition at the time called Prop 130, which would increase restrictions on logging old growth, which was coming into play. It was proposed earlier in 1990. And there was real concern that companies would start speeding up their logging of old growth areas to be able to get that logging done and liquidate those assets, as they were frequently referred to, before the proposition passed, and it would be really hard to log old growth. And the proposition was going to be voted on in November. So this was organized as I think it was a 3-month protest, and it was organized in a way to follow kind of the same tactics as Freedom Summer, which happened in the 60s. Freedom Summer from 1964 is the year. And so protesters were trained in nonviolent civil disobedience acts. And however, something to note is that Earth First, which was a group that organized this, was labeled by many as a terrorist group because one of the tactics that was used at one point in time was tree spiking. It'd be where there would be a metal spike put into the side of the tree to prevent lumber workers from cutting down the tree because it would damage their equipment. It would be very dangerous to have a metal spike flying at you out of a tree. But there was a metal spike that ended up in a tree, and it ended up in a mill, and a mill worker almost died because he was hit by the spike. Leaders of Earth First condemned that practice, but it left a poor image on the group for many people, especially people who did not support the acts of Redwood Summer. And there's a lot more to go into that as well. So right before these protests started happening, the leader of Earth First, Judy Berry, and another leader were driving around the Bay Area, and there was a pipe bomb that exploded in their car. They were arrested by the FBI for carrying around explosive devices. It was later found, I think it was in 2001, the court case finally ended, that Berry was not at fault for the pipe bomb explosion, and there was never really a resolution on how the pipe bomb ended up in their car. So it was a really kind of strange time. And the FBI could not prove that Judy Berry had put the pipe bomb in her car, and she had claimed that she had not either. So anyway, so now Headwaters. So Headwaters is a specific kind of part of forest that's by the south side of Eureka. And at this point in time, Headwaters had always kind of been a debated place to save as part of this Redwood Summer movement. But what really kicked the movement to save specifically Headwaters was when a guy named Charles Hurwitz took over Pacific Lumber Company, which is down in Scotia. And the way he took over that company was really interesting. And it's in a kind of this crazy economic way of a hostile takeover was what it was called. It had to do with him and different shell companies purchasing a majority of the stock of Pacific Lumber Company and basically rolling in there and saying, we own this company now. We're going to do what we do. And it was supposed that Hurwitz had purchased Pacific Lumber Company because Pacific Lumber Company at the time was family operated. It had been family operated for decades. And they had their system set up in a way where they would do selective logging. So there was lots of old growth still remaining on all their property because they'd come in and they'd take selective trees. They wouldn't clear cut everything. They would pick out what they wanted to take, ensuring that their timber yield would be sustained for a very long time. So Hurwitz saw that there was so many assets in all these trees that he could liquidate, make a lot of money, and then leave. And Hurwitz had accrued a good bit of debt at the time. So many people thought that he purchased he took over Palco, Pacific Lumber, specifically to get rid of those debts. So I want to show a brief little video here. Redwood Summer, where the 90s begins. And this is just a little bit of information on this. This is a recruitment video for Redwood Summer for the members of Earth First. We'll watch the first 5-ish minutes of it. And we can check out what was going on. And this is a really interesting video because you can actually see what some of the activists are doing as part of Redwood Summer. And since this is so recent, like I have a friend or two that participated in these protests. So let's take, whoops.
To make any regulations a moot point by the
but
time
we're just going to watch the first 5 minutes. So let me rewind a little bit.
time will tell, time will tell.
Last year was the hottest summer ever in record, and the 5 hottest summers ever recorded were all in the 1980s. The greenhouse effect is happening. Scientists around the world are unanimous. The planet is sick. The signs are incontrovertible, and we have less than 10 years to make the decisions to turn it around.
Have you seen your Redwood forest?
All over the world, small groups of people are forming together and realising that what we're witnessing is it's not the destruction of scenery, this is the dismembering of the life support systems of the earth, and that people are realising that the earth is a living organism and that the rainforests are one of the vital organs, so that if we want to have any future ourselves, or if we want to ensure a future for complex life on earth, we can't allow the rainforests to disappear.
It's a treasure of the ages in the hands of greedy men.
A forest isn't just a collection of trees. A forest is the air that comes out of that land. A forest is the water. It's the soil with all of the microorganisms in it. It's the wildlife, and yes, it's trees. But that whole system is a forest.
I believe this is our last chance. I think that they're killing the forest. I don't just think this, I live there. I've seen the miles and miles of clear cut. I've seen the ruined streams. I've seen the ruined soil. The forest can't recover if you continue to cut it and cut it. And these companies don't care. All they want is profits. All they want is money. Their plan is to cut and run, and we're not going to let them do it.
No compromise, no compromise, no compromise, no compromise in defense of Mother Earth. So how do we make up for our mistakes? The answer is whatever it takes.
The reason we called for Redwood Summer this year is because the crisis is this year. We don't have any more years to wait. This is not a symbolic act. We hope to literally slow down the logging by using our bodies non-violently this summer, and we hope to do that so that there'll be something left to save by the time any legislation can be passed to regulate them.
We are cutting chainsaws, killing the trees, disrupting everything that lives in peace. Our animal friends are on the run, but there's nowhere to go when the job is done.
People have gotten together several ballot initiatives to try to restrict the logging. The reaction of the timber industry has been to try to take every tree that they can as fast as they can to make any regulations a moot point by the time that they're passed. And once, if any laws are passed in the fall, they'll immediately sue and hold them up in court long enough for them to literally destroy the ecosystem. So we see this as a crisis. It's either now or never.
How can we stand by while this all takes place? We've got to stop this inhuman race. No compromise. No.
All right, so let's switch back over to here real quick. So pretty interesting video. It gives you a little bit of the views of the protest organizers. It gives you a really great view at some of their protest actions, like dressing up in costume, protesting at board meetings and things like that. And it's really interesting. So the goals of this protest, of course, are to protect the remaining old-growth redwood forest held by Pacific Lumber Company, thereby preserving different ecosystems that were under threat by this logging. Some of the actions that took place were tree sits. So right here in the middle, we have a picture. The young lady on the bottom is Julia Butterfly Hill. This is a picture of her in a redwood tree named Luna. She spent a very, very long time in Luna. I think it was over a year. It might've been edging on 2 years, but she was a tree sitter. She has a really interesting personal history as well. She had a near-death experience and then ended up getting into protesting to save redwood trees. She has a really interesting book, The Legacy of Luna, worth reading. The picture above her is a picture of an earth firster named David Nathan Chain. His forest name was Gypsy. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But they both did direct action protesting in tree sits. The poster you see down in the corner there, Pacific Lumber, Stop the Plunder, Earth First. There's also a tree sitter. You can see him just a little bit at the top of the video there, or top of the picture there. Tree sits were very popular. They were very dangerous though. There were loggers who would constantly say disparaging things, threaten violence. There were supposedly hired kind of thugs to come out and intimidate protesters. It was a very dangerous thing, not to mention being in the top of a redwood tree when it gets windy or it gets stormy. In some of these places it would snow. It was a very dangerous act to take, but it was one that was very effective. As I mentioned, protesters trained in nonviolent civil disobedience acts. And so I mentioned there was the hostile takeover by Hurwitz and his company Maxam. So Hurwitz is up in the left corner here. His company was named Maxam, Maxxam, which just kind of sounds like a company that would show up in maybe the movie WALL-E. But anyway, so his move in acquiring Pacific Lumber was he started liquidating. So he started clear cutting, he started raiding people's pensions, and taking all the money he could out of the company. And technically it was his company and he had the right to do that. But was it the best thing for our local communities? Was it the best thing for our local forests? No, not necessarily. And there were loggers that did oppose what Hurwitz was doing, especially when they started noticing that this was going to have a long-term effect on the longevity of the company and the ability for generation after generation to work for this company. Hurwitz's liquidation was going to severely curtail that. So there were angry loggers who were afraid to lose their jobs because their protesters were slowing down logging, so the lumber companies would lay off people. They were also angry with the altered logging processes and practices. People did call out the change in practices dangerous to the workers, dangerous to the longevity of the forest, of course. But many couldn't speak out because they were afraid they would lose their jobs. So as I mentioned, there were a number of results that came out of this. So I saw there was a question about what happened to Luna. So Luna was, okay, so Julia Butterfly Hill was in Luna for really long time. And there was finally an agreement that was made where she would come out of the tree and there would be a protected area within a certain distance around Luna that would not be logged and Luna would not be cut down. So she came out of the tree and that area was preserved, but there was a point in time where there was someone that I don't think they ever found out who it was, but they went out and they cut a good-sized gash in the bottom of Luna. And people were really afraid that Luna was going to fall over in a windstorm, that Luna was going to die because of the damage. And there were different things constructed around the base of Luna to protect her from falling over. So Luna, as far as I know, is still standing. And part of the reason why they picked this particular tree to have Julia sit in was because there had recently been a landslide nearby, and it demolished a good part of a town. And Luna looked over the top of that town. So she was protesting not only to help protect the tree, but she was also protesting to help prevent that kind of damage from happening to a town again. The company that owned the land claimed that their logging practices did not cause the landslide, but it seems pretty likely that that was not the case. All right, so, oh, and I forgot to mention, so Headwaters. So Headwaters ended up becoming a park. And it was saved, but it was at a high cost. And it wasn't the entire area that the protesters wanted to protect. It was in the, I think it was tens of thousands of acres that the protesters wanted to protect. Only about 7,000 were saved. That land was purchased at fair market value from Hurwitz. And it was very expensive still. But there are numerous areas around Headwaters that are in kind of the easement process. So when the current owners pass away, the land will be added to the forest reserve. So it's going to expand. Also with the inclusion of Headwaters was the preservation of the historic Falk Lumbertown site, which is in Headwaters. There used to be buildings, but there are no longer buildings from what I hear. But it also led to the preservation of old growth habitat, really important to all kinds of different species. Something else that happened as part of this kind of arena of protests, particularly Headwaters, was the death of David Gypsy Chain. He was participating in a direct action protest and ended up being hit by a tree that a logger cut down. The logger was trying to scare David into moving away from the tree, but that didn't end up happening, and he ended up getting hit by it. And there's a really good book covering the history of how David got into this protest, how he died, and then how that affected the movement. And it's called A Good Forest for Dying. And that's a very interesting book. I have a copy of it and I've read it, and it's very good. It's a very unfortunate part of this protest. And it's really sad that had to happen, or that did happen. So the last protest I'm going to talk about, I got to hustle a little bit, I got 10 minutes, is the Strike for Peace. And that was in 1970. So we're going a little bit back in time here. So that was that happened during the Vietnam War. So what had happened here was Richard Nixon was elected president. One of the things he ran on was that he was going to start taking troops out of Vietnam, but he ended up sending additional troops to Cambodia. There had also recently been a protest at Kent State, which is what the picture is on the right here, that ended when 4 students were shot while protesting during protesting the Vietnam War. So this protest was brought to Humboldt County as part of many protests that came out of this Kent State event. So the goals for this protest were to show support and de-escalation and eventual end of the Vietnam War, along with showing solidarity with other protesters. And there were protests, happening all across the US. So these 3 images are from a collection called Strike for Peace that is at the HSU Special Collections. These are all digitally accessible through their website, and I have the link at the end. So what what had happened was the actions that were taken at HSU included massive walkouts. There's an estimate about 50% of students participated, along with 60 faculty members. There were assemblies at the plaza. There were assemblies on campus as well. There was also a ham radio connection that was set up at Clam Beach to communicate with Stanford about how their protests were happening at the same time. There was also, it was a really organized protest that happened kind of over the course of a week, actually. So there was door-to-door canvassing. There was an estimated 16,000 Humboldt County residents that were reached during this door-to-door canvassing. And there was kind of a impromptu survey that was taken afterwards. And from those people surveyed, there was actually a significant number of people who changed their minds on the war due to these efforts. And let's see. So results from this, it was praised as a peaceful, orderly, and well-organized protest. No one died in this protest. It was praised that way by residents, faculty, and other colleges as well. It was kind of a short-term protest that happened over the course of that one Strike for Peace week, which was May 11th through 15th, 1970, and the protests kind of declined after that. So this was a really interesting collegiate protest. And there are all kinds of great pictures of related items, photos like these students walking out, this letter from the president of Humboldt State College, which was what it was called at the time, Cornelius Siemens, sending a letter to the president discussing the expansion of the war and how this last sentence is particularly powerful. The college community now needs fully justifiable acts and assurances to maintain or regain its faith in national leadership and to dispel its feeling of futility. That is powerful. So as I mentioned, those photos were from the Humboldt State Special Collections. This is their little online exhibit. Let's take a look real quick. Oh man, we only got a couple minutes left. Whoop. Okay, so we'll take a quick look. Okay, so it's got some information on the protest that was happening. Here are some of the digitized items related to it. It's got some great protest posters. And this is a kind of a part of many projects that HSU has to digitize their collections and make them more accessible to the public. And I really like these pictures. These are some great pictures. So if you're familiar with HSU, this is the Van Dusen Theater that people are sitting on the roof of. This is that plaza just outside of, I think it was called Redwood Plaza at the time. It's just kind of a quad now. But anyway, great website, good information, lots of great pictures. So with that, I will wrap it up. Here's some of the resources that I highly recommend looking into. So the items that are underlined are links, so you can go to different websites. The ones that are not underlined are typically books. Remember that if you are a Clark member, you do get discounts on local history books, which I think many of these, except maybe The Fight to Save the Redwoods by Susan Schrepfer, many of these are still local history books, so you can get a discount on them if you show them your membership card. Here's some more links, and of course this will be uploaded after this video is shared. Thank you for tuning in, everyone. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the little comments. I'll take a look at what we got going on here. So let's see. So what happened to Luna? We got that one. I researched this all for a story, but it was a long time ago and I can't remember the details. Thank you. You're welcome. And of course, there's all kinds of more information online too. As I mentioned, this was just kind of a brief overview of some of the protests, and some of them are even just pieces of protest. So I highly recommend looking more into it. These resources are great for that kind of thing. Let's see, and then what's next for next week? Ooh, I'm not sure what's up next for next week. But if you have any suggestions, feel free to add them. I might revamp some of my previous presentations that I've done, maybe share some of those with you guys, or just do a standard question and answer session. If you guys have questions, feel free to send them our way. If you enjoyed this presentation, feel free to share it with your friends, share it with your family, share it with that guy that lives down the street. You can also go check out more information on our website, check out other videos we've done. You can become a member, or you can send us a donation. Memberships start as little as $10 per month, or $25 for a year if you're a student or a senior. If you're not a student or a senior, they start as low as $55 for the year. And you get invites to special events when we're able to have them again. You get, like I mentioned, that 10% discount at Eureka Books. You also get that if you get the $10 a month membership as well. So yeah, I hope you guys had a good time. And I know I have a good time doing these talks, sharing information. You know, our mission is to educate the public, well, briefly, to educate the public on our region's history. So doing stuff like this is really good for us. And I hope it's, you know, you guys are gaining something out of it as well, because that's the point. Oh, we got a suggestion for a walking tour of the Victorian room. Let's see. So our senior age, I believe, is 55 for memberships. There's a question on that. I might be a senior tomorrow. Haha. Anyway, so thanks again for tuning in. Looks like we have 2 more minutes. Toss me some questions your way. I'm trying to think if there's things I might have forgotten to mention. Let's see. So anyway, also, just as an update on when we're going to reopen, we currently don't have an anticipated date for reopening, but we are keeping tabs on what the county is saying, what the state is saying, what the federal government is saying when it comes to reopening. And we look forward to reopening, you know, hopefully soon, as soon as it's safe. And we're looking forward to it. Oh, we do have a question. So what is the largest protest here so far? I forgot to mention that. So the Strike for Peace had about 3,000 people participating in it. And from the things I've read, that was the largest protest in Humboldt County to that point. The largest protest since then was the Women's March, or the Me Too March, in 2017, the first one, where there was an estimated 5,000 people, although numbers ranged from something like 1,000 to something like 10,000. So kind of counting protest numbers is a tricky business. But that's, from what I've seen, that's probably been the largest one. Yeah. All right, so it looks like we are now at 3 p.m. So thank you again for tuning in. I look forward to chatting with you all next week. Feel free to send us your questions ahead of time, or just tune on in and hope you pick up some new knowledge. Anyway, so have a good one, everyone. We'll talk to you later.